in the trade, and hopefully the task force will be able to use this information to fashion a program that is going to work in terms of repair for the victims of enslavement, and also work in terms of getting through not just the legislature, but the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court poses an existential threat to any reparative program, but I think there's a way of getting around that. So having said that, I'm going to start broadly and then come down to specifics. So I'll begin by defining what a reparation is. At least among reparative scholars, we basically view a reparation, and if you look at the comfort women, the Holocaust, the apartheid in South Africa, response to apartheid, this pretty much represents what happened in those venues. A reparation is an act of restitution, repayment performed by the perpetrator of an atrocity as a way of making amends for the commission of the atrocity. Now, what is an atrocity? That's a difficult question. I remember, again, as I said, I've been doing this for a long time. So back in 2000, big conference of reparative scholars in Copenhagen, and we fought for a whole week over that. And I think the consensus definition is that an atrocity is an exceptional act of human degradation, an exceptional act of human degradation. Reparations are but one way of responding to or redressing an atrocity. There are apologies, there are truth and reconciliation commissions or truth commissions, there are truth litigation or trials, and the forms of redress are limited only by the human imagination. You can come up with almost anything. Like all forms of redress, reparations are, by definition, asymmetrical. That is to say, they only apply to the victims of a particular atrocity. So, for example, African Americans are not entitled to reparations under the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provides reparations to Japanese Americans for the internment of Japanese Americans in the Second World War. So that's an important distinction to make. And which is to say that reparations are structurally different from garden variety civil or human rights measures, because these measures tend to be symmetrical in nature. They apply to all classes protected under the existing law, to any race, any color, any sex, or to citizens. Even though apology is the typical form of redress, which it is, nation states that have committed atrocities have in fact provided reparations to their victims. Germany paid reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, South Africa to the victims of apartheid, and the United States government to Japanese Americans who were interned during the Second World War. There are some, like Japan refuses to pay reparations, or what the victims of the comfort women, the victims of the Japanese Imperial Army's system of sexual enslavement during the Second World War. What they want is atonement money. They don't want just reparations, they want atonement money. And I must admit that they've, more than anything else, have sort of structured my view of reparations. There are basically two forms of reparations. They go by various names. One form is sort of victim focus or individual focus, and they're usually referred to as compensatory reparations. The other form is community directed or institutional directed, and they are generally referred to as rehabilitative reparations. Now, both forms of reparations come as in different forms, as cash payments to the victims, so monetary reparations, or as non-monetary reparations, such as services, programs, new laws, museums, or commemorations, that sort of thing. The other thing to note, which is quite critical and something that the task force is going to have to decide, and if you are going to go with monetary reparations, you have to decide if they're going to be restricted or unrestricted. An example of a restricted monetary reparation are scholarships or vouchers for housing or education. The pushback on that is that if you put restrictions on monetary reparations for slavery, then what you are doing is you are denying agency to the victims. So that's an issue that has to be addressed if you're going to go in that direction. I don't think you ought to go in that direction, monetary reparations. I think you ought to do rehabilitative. But if you go in that direction, you're going to have to make that decision and have some discussion around that issue. So one has to decide then whether or not you are going to go with individual reparations or institutional reparations. And if you're going to go with individual reparations, are they going to be restricted or are they going to be unrestricted? Now, the answer to all of this really depends on the purpose of the reparations. What are you trying to do? Because reparations and all forms of redress must be deployed with purpose. There has to be some purpose. You don't just get up and just do it. There has to be some purpose. What do the victims ultimately want to achieve? Do they want compensation or do they want reconciliation? Reconciliation. This is the question that the models of redress attempt to answer. And so reparations and other forms of redress are deployed under two basic models, the tort model and the atonement model. When victims picture reparations solely or mainly as a means of repayment for past harms, they are proceeding under the tort model. And when you look around the world at reparative programs, this is what they come into, the tort model. They fall into these two categories for the most part. But when the victims picture reparations as a path to racial reconciliation, for example, some form of reconciliation between the victims and the perpetrator, they then are proceeding under the atonement model. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the comfort women, they did not want any kind of payment from the government unless it was atonement. So what is atonement? Atonement is necessary, as I said, for reconciliation. But atonement is an apology and then reparations to solidify the apology, to make the apology believable. I wrote a book 20-some years ago. It says when saying sorry isn't enough. So racial reconciliation requires atonement, an apology plus reparations. And also from the victim, it requires some sort of expression of forgiveness. You can't have reconciliation unless you have some action on both sides of the equation. So reparations then serve distinctly different purposes under the tort model and the atonement model. Under the tort model, a reparation is essentially compensatory. Whether you are proceeding at the individual or at the institutional level, the reparation under the tort model is all about sort of balancing out the accounts. Under the atonement model, a reparation is the revelation or realization of an apology, and it's it's necessary if there's going to be any sort of racial reconciliation. Okay, now, critical race theory has to factor into this, because critical race theory has a perspective on this, which I think I see kind of reflected in the report. And so let me draw it out. Critical race theory would argue that as a precondition for racial reconciliation, the reparations must cut deep into the structure or fabric of our society. That is to say, social transformation. Social transformation requires rehabilitative reparations that are going to dismantle white hegemony. That is to say, they're going to extinguish the white hegemony norm, which is accepted in this society. And that is also going to uproot systemic racism across the board in education, in housing, in employment, politics, law enforcement, what have you. So within the international context, this is referred to as transitional justice, society transitioning toward justice, toward something new. So the question is, do we go that far? Is that what we want here? That's a question that has to be answered. And I don't know, is transitional justice possible in our society, in our state? South Africa tried it, transitional justice, and South Africa only got partial transitional justice. Political power, albeit in many instances corrupt, but a political power given to Black South Africans, but economic power remained with whites. And there's a tremendous amount of racial discrimination still in South Africa today. So do you want that? I sort of believe that African Americans that in California and in the United States in general, though, we may have to ask for something a little different, sort of like less extensive reparations, something along the lines of Japanese Americans, which leaves the social order largely untouched. And so both South Africa and Japanese American reparations were deployed through the atonement model with different reparative demands because the atrocities were different. So in my view, reparations cannot solve the problem of race in California or anywhere in the United States, because that would take decades. It would take massive amounts of money, a moral commitment, and I don't know that you want to wait for that to get reparations. So I think that something more limited has to be pursued, and something that will sort of move us toward resolving the race problem. And the report gives you all kinds of ways to go. What I like most is their discussion of foster children. So for example, if I can just read this. So Black children in California make up approximately 22% of the foster population, but only 6% of the general child population. Okay, so that tells me that perhaps we ought to have an educational reparation that consists of Black boarding academies, primarily for low-income African-American children who are at risk of falling into the foster care system. And these institutions would be controlled by African-Americans, and they would be patterned after the great prep schools of New England, which teach leadership skills, but here also teach Black heritage and a commitment to helping other African Americans. That's the long and short of it. Thank you.
I thought I was going to do it I'm gonna go ahead. Save some time here. I hope everyone can hear me. Don Tamaki is a senior counsel at Menominee Tamaki LLP. Prior to January 1st, he was the firm's managing partner. He is a member of California's task force to study reparations. For over 38 years, he specialized in providing value-driven legal counsel to entrepreneurs.
Okay, you can cut the commercial ad. I'm going to spare you. I'm going to spare you. Thank you. No, I really appreciate this. And probably the most relevant thing that me and my colleagues are known for is reopening Korematsu versus the United States. This is a 1944 decision that you all in the law school are reading, but you didn't know that it's a product of fraud on the high court in which the government suppressed, altered, and destroyed evidence in order to manipulate the outcome of that decision. So in the 80s, literally 37 years later, we reopened that and rewrote that history. I want to thank, before I start, my colleague, Chair Camila Moore. Great job today in the presentation. And Professors Moss West, Abriel, and Armstrong. Thank you so much for putting this on, and the students and faculty of Santa Clara University Law School. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Japanese American experience and how it relates in today's world, in particular with other non-Black groups. I want to say, while there is no equivalence between the discrimination that Japanese Americans experienced and centuries of racial oppression endured by African Americans, the 20-year Japanese American redress and reparations movement is one of the few modern examples where the US government acknowledged a great wrong and paid money for it. Following President Franklin Roosevelt's signing of Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, almost 120,000 Americans were forced out of their homes and incarcerated in 10 concentration camps from California to Arkansas. What was their crime? They happened to look like the enemy. General John L. DeWitt, who engineered the mass incarceration, declared that, quote, the Japanese race is an enemy race. A series of laws and orders then followed, targeting Japanese Americans merely for existing. Executive Order 9066 empowered the general to designate military areas from which any person could be excluded. So the next day after the order was signed by Roosevelt, DeWitt designated virtually the entire Western states as Military Area 1, on which any person could be excluded. On March 21, 1942, the Roosevelt signs Public Law 503, which stated, quote, whoever shall enter, remain in, or leave any military zone shall be guilty and liable for imprisonment. Military zone, in this case, was the entire West Coast. 6 days later, DeWitt issued another order making it a crime for Japanese Americans to leave Military Area 1. A month after that, DeWitt signs another order making it a crime for Japanese Americans to remain. Public Law 503 presented Japanese Americans with diametrically contradictory orders, simultaneously making them criminals if they left their homes or if they didn't leave. Obedience to one part of 503 would necessarily violate the other. The only way that Japanese Americans could avoid criminal prosecution was to submit at gunpoint to indeterminate confinement, abandoning their property, their businesses, and taking only that which they could carry. The concentration camps closed around March of 1946. The economic losses were incalculable, certainly in the billions of dollars in today's metrics. Japanese Americans returned to the very communities that exiled them in the first place. Many were homeless and traumatized, so they kept their mouths shut and didn't talk about their bitter experience, even with their own children. Inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement, however, Japanese Americans who were children or babies in the camps or born after the camps were closed began questioning the injustice that victimized their families And by 1970, organizing emerged, calling for reparations, which, by the way, was extremely controversial, even in our own community. The Japanese American community faced several obstacles when struggling with the concept of redress, and you'll probably recognize them but because they're relevant in today's struggle. First, the redress movement needed to overcome arguments that this was a different generation's action and too far in the past for modern remedies. Second, the redress movement also demanded an admission by the federal government that the forest removal was wrong. Third, the idea of redress involved monetary payments in an era of fiscal restraints. There are three sources of opposition primarily: those who refused to acknowledge the wrong, those who feared the precedent that redress would set for other wrongs, and those who opposed monetary payments. Consequently, most Japanese Americans initially viewed the possibility of obtaining redress for their imprisonment as highly unlikely. Moreover, our history had been erased, and even members of our own community had no idea to the extent that they had been screwed because the information had been suppressed or not talked about. Therefore, movement strategists devised a two-step approach. One, a 1980 study bill to create a commission to conduct hearings and assemble evidence to educate the American public. And two, 8 years later, a bill for actual compensation. Strategists reasoned that without first educating the public about the harm, that a reparations bill would have no chance. Therefore, in 1980, Congress passed a bill creating the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. This was a study bill, not a reparations bill. And it spanned a period of 3 years of organizing and educating the American public. After the commission conducted 10 nationwide hearings and issued a report garnering national publicity, and organizers had transformed what was dismissively characterized as a grievance of a tiny minority and turned it into an American issue of fundamental justice. Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that Professor Brooks referred to, signed by then President Reagan, providing $20,000 to each Japanese American who had been incarcerated and alive at the time the bill passed. An apology was also included and a fund to educate the public of this history. Of the 120,000 victims, about 80,000 received compensation. Those who died in the camps or before the bill passed got nothing. Japanese Americans know how crucial reparations were in the healing of our community from this great wrong and in teaching America how easily democracy crumbles when racism shouts louder than the Constitution. You might ask, why should Japanese Americans, or for that matter, any other non-Black group, care about reparations for African Americans? Let me answer that by juxtaposing two seemingly unrelated historical events. In 1943, 63-year-old James Wakasa was confined at Topaz concentration camp in Utah, along with my mother and father and about 10,000 other Americans. One evening, Wakasa took a stroll along the camp's barbed wire fence line. From 300 yards away, a sentry atop a guard tower took aim and fired, the bullet striking Wakasa in the chest and killing him. No inquest was held, and the guard was exonerated after claiming that Wakasa was trying to escape. 2 years later, in 1945, O'Day Short, his wife Helen, 7-year-old Carol Ann, and 9-year-old Barry moved into the house they built in Fontana, California. Sheriff warned Short they should go back to their Black neighborhood. His real estate agent advised, "Vigilantes had a meeting here last night, and if I were you, I'd get my family out of here." 2 weeks later, an explosion engulfed the house. Neighbors saw Helen try to beat back the flames, consuming her children. All family members died. The San Bernardino County District Attorney concluded it was an accident. The California Attorney General decided that no evidence of vigilante activity could be found in Fontana. Other than the fact that these two events occurred within 2 years of each other, what ties them together? I would argue that the answer is that the hate resulting in the deaths of James Wakasa and the Odell Short family has its origins in the racism that propped up the institution of slavery and its aftermath. As Camilla Moore pointed out, slavery has existed for thousands of years, but it was only in the past 400 to 500 years that white Europeans developed a type of enslavement based on skin color to justify permanent, multi-generational subjugation upheld by a culture of white superiority. Once the culture of 1619 used race to dehumanize people to the level of pigs and goats, in the words of Martin Luther King, thingifying them, then the most heinous crimes against humanity would follow without a second thought. Following the end of slavery in 1865, this cultural norm, I think that Dr. Brooks just referred to, of valuing white lives above all others, morphed into forms of hate that put a target on the backs of not just African Americans, but of other people of color, including James Wakasa. And some of the other speakers addressed that fact. Simply put, if you can thingify Black people, then demonizing any other disfavored groups is easy. Slavery begat the cultural foundation of America's racial hierarchy of white people on top, Black people on the bottom, and everybody else in between. The California Reparations Task Force just published, as was stated, a sweeping nearly 500-page report drawing a through line from the harms of 250 years of slavery and racial terror, 90 years of Jim Crow, and decades more of continuing discrimination, resulting in today's outcomes, which are at once shocking but not surprising. With respect to housing and education, for example, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. The wholesale exclusion of African Americans from equal education, employment, the benefits of the New Deal, federally insured home loans, the ability to live in the suburbs, and other opportunities that created America's middle class and it has resulted in white households, as Camilla Moore pointed out, having 9 times more assets than Black households, Black people having shorter life expectancies than the rest of the population, Black women dying at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women from complications relating to pregnancy and childbirth, and huge disparities persist in housing, houselessness, policing, and criminal justice, and almost all aspects of American life. So where do we go from here? When it comes to African Americans, this is to Kyle Perkins' point, the student here at Santa Clara. When it comes to African Americans, Congress has proven unwilling to even study the enormity of the nation's past and continuing injustice. So we need to build public support. So leaders like, I'm pleased, James Woods, Deborah Moss West, and others are really part of a public awareness campaign calling for simple justice, and by asking bar associations, Black Law Students Associations, other women's organizations, in higher education, civil rights, labor, professional societies, the faith community, etc., to endorse the study of reparations, to endorse the task force's report, or its findings to move this issue in the public conversation, to shine a light on this. So for the next few months, love to see dozens of organizations endorse the study, at least minimally. That's kind of the lowest common denominator. But in the next 6 months, there are hundreds of organizations in California. So happy to discuss this with you if you and your organization are interested in joining this effort. So I'm going to close here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. Didn't get a chance to say that. Thank you. Tamaki. And I will introduce James Woodson as he comes. James Woodson is the Executive Director of the California Black Power Network, a growing ecosystem of Black-led and Black-serving community-based organizations working together to change the lived conditions of Black Californians by dismantling systemic and anti-Black racism.
Thank you, Deborah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is, again, James Woodson. I'm an organizer and an attorney, and I have the privilege to lead this 40 organization network that you see on the screen. This comes out of work that we've been doing at California Calls under the legendary Anthony Thigpen, who's been a longtime community organizer. You know, these are groups that deal directly with the effects of slavery and anti-Black racism. You have groups that work with folks that are formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated. One group actually organizes current and former gang members. We've got folks that work with homeless folks, Black workers, immigrants and refugees, which has often been left out of this conversation, faith-based communities, and sort of runs the gamut. You know, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing for this panel is when we think about reparations, right, and we think about repairing harm, two questions to me come up. The first question is, what harm are we actually trying to repair? And then the second question is, well, how do we repair that harm in the society in which we live, right? Because reparations is going to look different depending on what country, what state you're thinking about, right? Reparations would look different in Germany or in China or Russia than it does in America and in California. And so those are two of the questions that I want to kind of take on today. One, what is the harm that we're trying to repair? And what does that look like here in the United States and in California? I don't think we can talk about what repair would look like without talking about this word. So you all know, obviously, we live under a capitalistic society, and whatever feelings you have about that system, right? A lot of times folks just, when you hear the word capitalism, you think about money. And people just say, right, it's an exchange of money for goods and services. But actually, that's not true, right? Capitalism is really about capital, which is about more than just money. And as you see in this definition, right, it's about ownership and who controls what. And so, right, if we're going to really repair harm, we got to think about how we transition control, how we transition power when it comes to how society actually works. And so one of the things you might hear in my presentation is a little different than what Professor Brooks talked about. I actually think there has to be some transitional justice work in reparations, because the current system that we're living in actually is continuing to harm Black folks, as the interim report shows, right? We know that there's harm still being done in the housing system, in the criminal justice system, and so on, right? And so in order to not, regurgitate and perpetuate that harm, there has to be some transition that happens. This is just another definition, but again, you're looking at, right, economic system based on private property, on profit, on free market, and on competition. And if you aren't addressing, right, private property and how that works, if you're not addressing how people actually profit in society, if you're not addressing the market forces that control how the society operates, you're actually not able to repair harm in the way that's actually going to impact Black folks. So, you know, I think a lot of times, right, when folks think about, again, the repairing of harm, you know, they think about the economic harm that's been caused, right? Black people had to work for free for, you know, centuries, right? Without payment. And so obviously there is an economic harm there that needs to be repaired. But we know that there's also these other harms that are taking place, right? So we know that there's physical harm, not only in terms of, you know, Black folks having to labor, being whipped, right, during slavery, but we know our healthcare system also has disparities that affect people's physical health, right? Psychological, right? We know that mental health and mental illness is a thing just throughout society, but we know, you know, folks, you know, going through the criminal justice system, going through homelessness, which disproportionately impacts Black folks, have psychological harm that they are dealing with. And if reparations doesn't deal with those things, then it's not truly repairing the harm that's being caused. Same thing with the emotional harm, right? We know that families were ripped apart. We know that families are still being ripped apart by folks who are going into jail, into prisons, right, and being ripped away from their families. And so again, right, reparations needs to address all of these harms, not just the economic piece. And so you'll hear a lot of folks, right, talk about cash payments, and we are absolutely for cash payments. But right, reparations needs to be comprehensive to be able to address all of those harms. And so, you know, Chair Moore actually talked about these principles, right? The UN 5 principles, right? Cessation, assurances and non-repetition, restitution and repatriation, compensation, satisfaction and rehabilitation. I won't go through all of those things because I think she already did that. But again, sort of agreeing with her, right? If reparations doesn't include all 5 of these things, it is not truly reparations, and that is what we are going to be continuing to push for. You know, so what I mentioned before, we are really an organizing and advocacy group. And so we have been engaging community. We were honored to be one of the 7 community groups that were doing community engagement on behalf of the task force during the summer. We also do voter engagement. And so we did a June voter engagement program around the June primary. We were out doing phone calls, door knocking for 15 days with 16 organizations, almost 100 outreach workers. We ended up contacting 23,000 people about reparations. We were talking to them directly about reparations. And we identified 8,700 people who wanted to participate in one of our listening sessions. And the way the listening sessions worked is that you had to sort of testify, you got a certain amount of time to do that. And so we couldn't, right? We didn't have the capacity to bring all 8,700 of those folks into our listening sessions, but we did hold some. We held 10, both in-person and virtual sessions. 10 of our organizations were the hosts of those, and we were able to engage almost 300 folks in those listening sessions. And again, we asked folks, what do you want to see in reparations? And what you got is a range of things, right? Some comprehensive proposals. So we kind of divided these in the 5 UN principles. So you see restitution, right? You see things about free tuition, increased funding and resources for Black students K through 12, employment resources and opportunities for FIP is formerly incarcerated people, right? Making sure that that reparations is multi-generational and addresses the multi-generational harm that is taking place. Again, economic empowerment, right? So we certainly heard about cash payments, but we heard about also no income taxes for Black residents, small business grants and loans, compensation to Black families whose businesses were destroyed. We also heard things about land, right? And transferring land, home ownership opportunities and grants, freezes on property taxes, particularly for folks who are older, affordable housing opportunities. You know, under satisfaction, certainly we heard things about an apology, but we also heard things about how do we educate K through 12 students, higher education, right? How do we have honest curriculums that tell the truth about the history of what happened, much of what you heard today. We saw, you know, things around, again, policy solutions that address all of the discrimination that we have in sort of government, public institutions, and the workplace, and then resources for businesses that benefited, resources from businesses that benefited from the slave trade and that capitalized off of Black people and Black culture. I think this is the last one. Yeah, finally is guarantee of non-repetition. And so I think Chair Moore talked about involuntary servitude out of the Constitution, right? We certainly heard folks mentioning that as a piece of this, ending mass incarceration and over-policing in Black neighborhoods, divestment from carceral systems, for preservation and protection of Black communities that are being gentrified and displaced, and expanded representation for Black people on decision-making bodies. You know, this last slide is just really sort of next steps and ways to stay engaged. But what I'll say sort of in closing is we really just encourage, you know, reparations to be bold and to be comprehensive for a few different reasons, right? One is that, again, I mentioned this, the current social order is actually continuing to harm Black people. And so we have to shift how that looks to end the harm. The second is, right, California, and Chair Moore mentioned this, California is the first state to really sort of take this on in a major way. So California is going to serve as a model for the way the rest of the country, you know, states in the rest of the country addresses it, and the way the federal government addresses it, right? California being a progressive state and a blue state is our best opportunity to try to push something bold, because we know it's going to get watered down in other states. And so we really are encouraging California to be bold on this issue so that other states can be bold. Number three is, right, like if racism, if we're going to acknowledge that if racism is still going to exist after reparations, why would we not be bold, right? Why would we not try to get as much as we could possibly get through this process if we know that folks are still going to be racist even after this, right? The last point that I wanted to make is that I think it's dangerous to go small, because we know, right, we already have people who are telling Black folks that we passed the Voting Rights Act, we elected a Black president, right? You got your reparations. And so we know that that's just going to ramp up once reparations passes. And people are going to say, look, we gave you reparations. You should stop complaining. You should stop asking for things, right? And so, again, I think this is an opportunity to really be bold, to really be comprehensive in what we ask for, because I think it's going to have repercussions and reverberations throughout the rest of the country and the state. And we're really just encouraging the task force to really take that into account. And again, just to be bold and comprehensive. So thank you.
Thank you so much, James Woodson. Our final speaker today, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions, is Dr. Daniels. Dr. Daniels is the founder and president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, a progressive, African-centered, action-oriented resource center dedicated to empowering people of African descent and marginalized communities. That's all he said I could say.
Well, you can say I'm the convener of the National African American Reparations Commission.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is okay. Well, what an amazing day. And I am so delighted and honored to have been invited to be here. I'm a little battle fatigued because there's a lot of work being done, but we want to thank the organizers for putting this together. And I just want to give a shout out to BALSA, the Black American Law Student Association, because that's back in the day organizing that comes out of the Black Power, Black nationalist movement. To see that being passed on intergenerationally is incredibly important. So let me just quickly do rapid speak because there is so much to say and so little time, and we do want time for Q&A at the end, but there is just so many questions to address. First thing I want to say is please do not buy into the hype that nothing's happening with reparations. Reparations is exploding all over the world. There's never ever been a time in my lifetime, and I've been working on reparations for a half century, that we've been at this point in terms of the development of reparations. In fact, some of you are involved because of the cross-generational engagement around this issue. And I've just returned from Accra. Go to the website, ibw21.org, ibw21.org. Go to the Reparations Resource Center. We have the most extensive, the National African American Reparations Commission, the most extensive online reparations resource center in the world. You will see the Accra Declaration, where we brought together in Accra over 100 reparations scholars, activists, political leaders from all over the world. And you will see the Accra Declaration. One of the things you will also see if you go to the website is the Vatican Initiative. We went to the Vatican after having been in Bellagio, Italy, convened by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was kind enough to use her Rockefeller scholarship to gather us also to do some planning and strategizing. We went to the Vatican and we have launched an initiative to call into account the Catholic Church for both sanctioning and benefiting from enslavement. Reparations is exploding all over the world. In fact, Professor Hilary Beckles, Google him, has said reparations will be the human rights issue of the 21st century. That's what's become happening, and you are part of it. You are part of making that history. So first of all, let me also just say quickly that the California Task Force is incredibly significant. The work is great that is being undertaken. I should say, however, it is important to also acknowledge that it was patterned after H.R. 40, the bill which has been transformed. I'll talk about that in a minute. And there are other efforts going underway. New Jersey is happening. It's underway. And Ryan Hager, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, is helping to lead that effort. And New York has actually passed a reparations bill in the House of Representatives or the lower house twice. It is being held up in the Senate, but it will soon be online. And California is serving as an inspiration, if not necessarily a model. And I say that because there are aspects of the discussion in California that may not migrate to California and New Jersey, particularly as it relates to the question of who should get reparations and on what terms. So we should understand that. We're in the academy. It's good to have some debate and discussion anyhow. So let's make sure. I want to make sure it's not sanitized in that regard. Let me just quickly say that the National African American Reparations Commission is incredibly important, not just because I happen to convene it, but we created it intentionally because we knew that in this period there would need to be an authoritative voice and body to help be a frame of reference. Because, people jump in and they get started, and that's a good thing. It is incredibly important that people are talking about equity. People are talking about all kinds of public policy, but not everything out here is public policy. It is reparations. Equity, for example, is great, but it is not reparations. Equity is about what happens now, henceforth, and forevermore. It does not deal with the cross-generational damages of enslavement and its legacies. And then there's a lot of good stuff happening that should be taken into account. And I think Professor our professor pointed that out. We just call it ordinary public policy. It's what the government ought to be doing anyhow. Jobs, education, a lot of that should be happening, but it's ordinary public policy. There's a specificity to the definition of reparations, and I'll be talking about that in just a moment. And so we put together a commission, and that commission includes people like Cam Howard, who is with NCOBRA. People should understand that NCOBRA for over 30 years was like the voice helping to organize and move reparations forward here in the United States of America. Among those who were founding members in Pt2, some of you know of her work. Justin Hansford, who has now become a part of the UN Permanent Commission on People of African Descent. Robin Rue Simmons, who was the architect of the Evanston Reparations Initiative, which I'll also reference in a moment. Montega Simmons, who's with the Movement for Black Lives. And we also have Reverend Robert Turner, who is from Tulsa. His church, the historic Vernon AME Church, was the last remaining structure, but he is very much on it in terms of understanding sort of the historical legacy and the kinds of work that needs to be done. So that commission that we put together has a mandate to do several things. Number one, its mandate is to was to develop and to popularize a 10-point reparations program, to give an idea of what reparations might look like. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But also to talk about local reparations, municipal reparations. In fact, Evanston was certified by the National African American Reparations Commission. Earlier, there was a question about what people could do. In California, it's not just the California Task Force. There are a number of local reparations initiatives happening. San Francisco happens to be one of them. LA is forming the commission. So there's also the push for local reparations as well as supporting the task force is an opportunity for you to become involved. But it's also, and this was referenced, it's also about colleges and universities. It's about families, it's about corporations. There's a broad ranging effort to cleanse America of all of the aspects of this infection of systemic racism. Now, in terms of the 10-point program, this 10-point program begins with an understanding of what reparations is. And it's been referred to, but I think it should be very clear about reparations. And of course, our professor who's I keep got to get his name down. Brooks. Professor Brooks was talking about it in various forms. But reparations is simply the repair for damages inflicted, and those damages can be physical, cultural, psychological. It could be the question of identity inflicted on one group by another. I mean, that's just a basic definition, right? And there are certain requirements that are involved in it. And one of the requirements is those who inflict the damage and harm cannot define the nature of the remedy. Because what happens very often is people said, well, we did it and we're going to give you some scholarships. We're going to do this and that. No, that cannot be. So you have to fundamentally, the persons who have been harmed have to be the ones who are actually dealing with the remedy. As it relates to African Americans, we have to understand that we're talking about the greatest Holocaust in human history. That's been referred to. The wealth of this country, the racialized capitalist system was built on the backs of Black free labor of Africans, not only here, but across the European continent. The best reference on this is Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Read it. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Barclays Bank, Lloyds of London, all of them were built on the wealth of formerly enslaved Africans. And many of the corporations in this country similarly. So reparations is for enslavement, but it is for more than enslavement. And we have to drive that point home. It is not just for enslavement. It is for all of the legacies of enslavement. All of the things that were laid out by our professor this afternoon from the Bar Association, who laid out all from the Homestead Act to the GI Bill, all of these are due reparations and repair. And all of these people are not necessarily African descendants or American descendants of slavery. I mean, you have people who came to this country who were victimized by these same policies. And so we're not going to leave any of that on the table. Plus, you know, I heard discussions about how we're going to trace, you know, and figure this out and all that. I'm not sure it's worth the exercise. Why would I try to trace the lineage to try to figure out which of the Africans are due reparations? We all due reparations. All Black people harmed in America by America should be repaired in America by America, period. That's an expansive definition. We're not leaving anything on the table. We're not telling Harry Belafonte that he ain't entitled to reparations. We're not telling Shirley Chisholm that. We're not telling Kwame Ture that. We're not telling Abner Louima, who was sodomized and brutalized by the New York Police Department, you ain't entitled to reparations because you're Haitian. Or Amadou Diallo, who was killed. They didn't ask him whether he was from Guinea. They didn't ask Amadou Diallo whether Abner Louima, where he was from Haiti or not. As Malcolm said, we all get oppressed for the same reason. We get oppressed because we are Black people. And when you look around the globe and you look at what's happening, we have people in all of these communities who are Black people, our sisters and brothers. Now, we've got some issues we need to talk about and that we need to discuss in some ways. But we're not going to limit what is due to us and on the basis simply of a narrow lineage-based proposition. So we start with that, and then we try to lay out a whole question of what reparations could look like. So we have a 10-point program. Quickly, what does it say? Number one, formal apology is always a part of the process. Apology begins the process. And we talk about the establishment of a knowledge program, because that was mentioned on your slide there. Black people need to know more about our history. The right of repatriation. Some people want to go back to the motherland. We should be able to do that with reparations. The right to land and social economic development. The right to land for social and economic development. Substantial tracts of government, of public land that could be put together for a reparations trust fund, for example. Number 5, resources for health, wellness, and the healing of Black families and communities. Education for community economic development and empowerment. We talk about affordable housing for healthy Black communities and wealth generation. We talk about preserving Black sacred sites, our sacred sites all across this country, sacred sites. There was a discussion about how many massacres took place, but it's not just the massacres, it's all the grave sites all around that have been just sort of run over and our ancestors being disrespected. That's a part of our sacred memory. And then also, finally, not last but certainly not least, the whole question of reforming the criminal injustice system. Now, what we say there is there's two basic concepts here. Number one, first of all, we always say this with the National African American Reparations Commission. There is no amount of money that could ever pay for the Holocaust of enslavement and all of the atrocities and pain that we've suffered. And we say that because some people simply wanted to reduce it to a check. And then there are people who are our adversaries who want to say, oh, they just want a check. Well, yeah, we're entitled to a check, but it's more than just a check. So we talk about, we believe in direct benefits. We call it that. But we also believe in community benefits, because community benefits deals with that which will accrue to all of us as Black people and help build the infrastructure of the Black community. Example, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, long since, there's maybe only 3 survivors left yet. They just finally got some corporate dollars donated and so forth and so on. But every descendant would be entitled to a cash payment. But at the end of the day, Black Wall Street, the Greenville district was destroyed. How do you rebuild that? You rebuild it through community benefits, if you understand what I'm saying. The healthcare system, the educational system, economic benefits that moved to get that done. So we should be talking about direct benefits as well as community benefits. Now, let me conclude by simply talking about where HR 40 is, because HR 40 and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee concurs with the analysis that was presented by my brother here. And that is, and I do too, that reparations is really fundamentally the overarching policy prescription that cuts to the heart of structural institutional racism. If we're not talking about if we're not talking about fundamentally transforming this nation on the basis of uprooting structural institutional racism, then it's really just a palliative. It's not really getting at something that our ancestors should be proud of in terms of what a new society should look like. So HR 40 was changed from originally it was a study bill. It is now a remedy bill, because the new bill is not just about studying, it's about developing reparations proposals for African Americans. And we developed a 10-point program so we would have something for the commission to look at. Because Sister Kamala is right, the real battle begins once the proposals have been passed. Will the New Jersey legislature, the California legislature actually pass anything? And then there will be a discussion about its restrictions and the judicial limitations and so forth. And of course, there will be, but we should not limit our vision. We should not limit our aspirations on the basis of what the Supreme Court looks like now. In fact, our dear beloved sister, our new Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown, the other day said something that was profound that a lot of people missed. And that is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were race-conscious amendments. They were, in fact, enacted for the formerly enslaved Black people. That's what they were. And the language in there specifically talked about the use of race. So she's challenging them to say, no, you can't come with race neutral, because 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and she talked particularly about the 14th Amendment, is race conscious. We have to pick up on that. Our lawyers, our legal theorists have to be pushing the envelopes. And finally, at the end of the day, we have to also understand that a lot of this is because of social movements. We are here in California, and all of this because of a cross-generational reparations movement from Callie House to Queen Mother Moore. And I have to invoke the name of John Conyers, the legislative champion who introduced HR 40 after having been inspired by the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 every year, and now picked up by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. It requires movement. So where are we now? The previous bill never had more than 50 sponsors. We now stand right now with HR 40 with 197 co-sponsors and 20 yes votes. We are one vote shy of getting it passed in the House of Representatives. However, y'all are political students, you know what the deal is. We could pass it, but would it pass the Senate? No. So we're not looking at passing it at the House of Representatives. We don't want a moral victory, we want a real victory. And that real victory, we're now challenging, and want you to be a part of the process, President Biden to do it by executive order. We're pressing President Biden to enact HR 40 by executive order. That's where we are. And by the way, once that happens, we're looking at the impact of what we're doing in this country is reverberating throughout the world. People are studying HR 40. They're studying California. They're studying when the first reparations were passed in Evanston, Illinois. We were interviewed all over the world, because this issue is not only going to cleanse America, it is about cleansing the entirety of the world, particularly those countries that in fact were involved in the enslavement of Africans and the colonization of African people, but now also that British Empire that they said the sun never set on. We want to make sure that the sun sets on it and that there's in fact real repair that takes place. So it's a lutte that can continue. You're all involved in it. You're student activists. We need your expertise and so forth, but this battle is real, and New York is going to follow. New Jersey is going to follow, but we sure are proud of what's happening in California. Thank you very kindly.
So thank you very much, Dr. Daniels. It's not a surprise that we are almost right out of time, because each of these panelists could have probably used the whole time. We would have been that engaged with learning from them. So what we might do now, because we have a reception right after this, is give each panelist an opportunity to provide some concluding remarks. Perhaps something was said that they'd like to respond to. So maybe a minute or two each, and then we can continue the conversation at the reception. Does that sound okay to you all? Okay, maybe I'll just pass it first.
I think my concluding remarks is how can we move the thing forward and get it into the public square? And if the student associations in the law school and higher education, the law school, but other departments in Santa Clara would be interested in pushing this out. I mean, certainly one way is get the report out, because I'm an old guy. In my day, we would do teach-ins, but convert it into, 500 pages is a lot, but convert it into readable material, although you don't have to have a PhD to understand it. It's beautifully written. But there's sections on enslavement, there's sections on housing. Those can be distilled into PowerPoints and other things and circulated in the schools. We're working on a campaign to get endorsements. And the idea here is if things can get started here at Santa Clara University, then they'll spread to the other institutions of higher education. So that would be my last words on this. How can we work together to get this as a mainstream conversation? Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. All right. Along those lines, I should mention, is this working? Yeah. That the law review at University of San Diego Law School, they're doing a symposium issue directed on the interim report. And that's going to be, I think, very beneficial, a lot of break. I think the thing that I want to leave you with is this. The NAACP decided that the best way to tackle segregation, Jim Crow, was to start with education. These are the innocents. And then once you establish a TOHO, you can expand into other areas, which is exactly what happened after Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation fell in housing and employment and what have you. That is the strategy I'm suggesting here. I think that there has to be more debate. I think this is good to have this kind of discussion, and it's needed. But I would just sort of say, I mean, I'm sort of personally beyond symbolism. I worked with some very good lawyers, including Johnny Cochran and legal scholars, including Charles Ogletree, on the complaint on the Tulsa race riot. We knew following that complaint we were going to lose because there are too many procedural hurdles. But we did it to make a statement. Beyond that, don't want to make any more statements. They want some tangible results. And I think that this is the best way to do it, to take all of these students, all of these children who are at risk in our foster care system, and educate them in an environment which is safe and which will lead to leadership positions later on. I think that's the best way to go. It's going to be almost impossible to get everything. Inflation, that's going to be your big enemy. You want all these programs? There are Black economists now who are pushing back from this massive approach because they're saying it's going to be inflationary. It's going to be a non-starter right then and there. So what I'm saying is that as a lawyer, I want to give my client the best possible legal advice. And my advice is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Let me just quickly say a couple of things I forgot. One, I forgot to give a reference to 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. One of my former lives was as executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. I work with lawyers. I work with some of the greatest constitutional lawyers in this era, not only people like Bill Kunstler and those. The lawyer, the leading expert on the 13th Amendment is Arthur Conoy. And I would give you that name, Arthur Conoy. And the work you should read is The Constitutional Right of Negro Freedom. The Constitutional Right of Negro Freedom, which he clearly lays out the foundation of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which needs to be resuscitated in the struggle that we're moving forward with now. And I would finally just say that I absolutely believe that the perfect should ought not to be the enemy of the good, but I also don't believe in limiting what it is that we should be aspiring for. You reach and you push and then you settle. You don't settle before you reach. And that's my position is that. And social movements, let me just re-enterprise. Social movements are the secret sauce that moves things forward. Who would have believed that marriage equality would have happened so fast? Why did it happen? Did it happen simply because people decided one day? No, because of social movements, powerful social movements that interacted in a way that politicians could no longer ignore it. So that's one of the key things we need to be talking about.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? I'm a lawyer, and I love lawyers, but we have never had systemic transformational change through just lawyering, right? I think my brother said here, it really comes from people power. And, you know, when we look at what happened in the summer of 2020, you know, I live in Los Angeles. When we look at what's happening now in Los Angeles, where folks are shutting down City Hall, that's what brings transformational change. And I think that's what we're trying to build at the Black Power Network. And I think there's opportunities to build that here. I'm glad that Member Tamaki has talked about how non-Black folks can get involved. Because I think that's what it's going to take is a multiracial push to really transform what this state looks like and ultimately what this country looks like. And so I'm ready to build that people power because I think that's what's going to ultimately change and get us to pass reparations.
Well, I just wanted to take a moment to thank this illustrious panel for not only coming here today and speaking about your work, but the work that you've done for years and years and years. Reminds me of a scripture that talks about never tire of doing what is good, be not weary in well-doing. And we just thank you so much for not growing weary, for keeping, for just really pressing on. And I think this is, for some folks here, a start of a conversation, hopefully a start of the doing, but we are, I think, all in this together and moving forward together. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm not sure if Professor Abriel has closing remarks, but thank you.
Things that why don't we thank this wonderful panel first? So I won't keep you long because we do have a reception to follow, and I know everybody's ready for that after this afternoon. But I have a number of people that I just needed to thank. And first is the planning committee, Professor Moss-West, Professor Armstrong, Carrie Bindi, Dr. Ray Plaza, Jason Cohen, and Chelsea Jordan, who are law students at the law school. So thank you guys, just did such a wonderful job on this planning. We can't thank you enough. Also, thanks so much to the sponsoring organizations. That would be the Catherine George Alexander Community Law Center, the Center for Social Justice, the University Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I think I'm forgetting something there, but I'm sorry if I am. There are also a number of student organizations who have had their students volunteer to work today. You've seen a number of students just helping out throughout the day, and thanks so much to all those organizations. And most of all, thanks to these speakers who have been, inspiring and moving and energizing and given us not only this illuminating information, but also called on us to be involved and given us concrete ways that we can become involved. And it's just been a transformative experience to listen to all of you throughout the day. And I think we also need to thank Dean Kaufman and Noelia McKeever of the Dean's Office, who gave invaluable support, and Professor Margaret Russell, who has been sort of our advisor all along. And thanks so much to our audience as well. It may look a little thin right now, but we've had 98 people online during the day. So in addition to the people who are here physically present, we've had a lot of online guests as well. So thanks to all of you who are listening online. So I think with that, we can call it a day. Thanks so much to everyone. And we can, I'd like to say one last thing. I wanted to say thank you to my husband, Bill Abrill, who has been here today and has been a silent partner on this whole project. So anyway, thank you all so much. And I think we can proceed to the reception.
It's been a lot of time. Yeah. Connection.